Break room smelled like burnt coffee and somebody's reheated fish, same as it had for the last 22 years. I noticed that on my last day. Funny how you stop seeing things when you see them every morning, and then the moment you know you won't see them again, everything sharpens up. My name is not important to this story. What matters is that I spent 22 years as the head of financial compliance at a mid-sized defense contractor outside of Richmond, Virginia. The kind of company that doesn't make headlines but keeps the lights on for a lot of people, 800 and some employees, government contracts, the kind of work that requires meticulous record-keeping and someone who knows exactly where every dollar goes and why. I was that someone. I started there at 34, right after my second daughter was born. The founder, a retired Army colonel named Quentin Marsh, hired me personally, sat across from me in a conference room with no windows and said, "I don't need someone who's impressive. I need someone who's right." I told him I could be both. He almost smiled. Quentin retired 6 years ago. His daughter inherited the company. She was sharp enough, kept her distance from day-to-day operations, let the people who knew what they were doing keep doing it. That worked fine. Then she hired her husband. His name was Derek, 31 years old, an MBA from Vanderbilt and a LinkedIn profile that called him a transformational leader and a disruptive innovator. He came in as Chief Operating Officer, which meant he was technically my boss's boss. Within 4 months, he was running Monday morning, all-hands meetings where he talked about reimagining the compliance architecture and leveraging agile methodologies for a financial reporting process that had passed 17 consecutive government audits. I sat in those meetings and wrote down what he said, not to be petty. I wrote it down because none of it meant anything, and I wanted to remember that clearly later. The first time he and I had a real conversation, he asked me how I managed the quarterly reporting to DCAA, the Defense Contract Audit Agency. I walked him through it. The process, the documentation trail, the indirect cost submissions, the way we flagged anomalies before they became findings. He nodded along and then said, "Yeah, I think we can automate a lot of that." I said, "Some of it, sure. The judgment calls, no." He looked at me the way young men look at older men when they've already decided the older man is the problem. That was November. By February, I had a meeting on my calendar titled Role Realignment Discussion. No agenda. Just Derek and someone from HR whose name I didn't recognize. I walked in knowing. 22 years, and I walked in knowing. The HR person, a young woman who kept her eyes on her laptop, slid a separation agreement across the table before Derek had finished his opening sentence. The sentence was something about evolving organizational needs and fresh perspectives. I let him finish. Then I looked at the agreement. 12 weeks of severance. Sober continuation. A non-disparagement clause. I picked up the pen they'd set out for me, which I thought was a nice touch, and I set it back down. "I'll need to have my attorney review this," I said. Derek's jaw moved slightly. He hadn't expected that. "Of course," the HR woman said, still looking at her laptop. I stood up. I thanked them for their time, genuinely, not sarcastically, though I understand that's hard to believe, and I went back to my office and started boxing up 22 years. My office wasn't big. A window that faced the parking deck. A filing cabinet I'd repainted myself because the original color was the specific shade of green that gives you a headache, and a photo of my daughters on the desk from a beach trip we took in 2019. I took the photo. I left the filing cabinet. I handed in my badge at 4047 in the afternoon. The security guard, a man named Everett who'd been there almost as long as I had, shook my hand and didn't say anything. That was the right call. I drove to a bar called Hazel's on Broad Street, a place I'd been going to for years because they keep the bourbon selection honest and the televisions at a reasonable volume. I found a stool at the far end of the bar and ordered a Blanton's, neat, and I sat there watching the March lake go gray outside the window. I wasn't angry yet. Anger came later, and even then it was a low, slow kind, not hot, just persistent, like a gas burner left on low. What I was, sitting there at Hazel's, was tired, and a little bit curious about how long it would take. I had 14 days before my system access expired. That was standard policy. I'd written the policy myself, 8 years earlier, after a separation situation that got messy. The outgoing employee's access ran for 2 weeks during transition. 14 days. I didn't go back. I spent the first week doing what my wife had been asking me to do for 3 years. I cleaned out the garage. I organized the tools. I threw away a box of cables that went to devices I no longer owned. I was home for dinner every night before 6, which hadn't happened since the first term of the Obama administration. On day 9, my phone started ringing. Not my personal cell. My work cell, which they hadn't asked me to return because it was on a personal plan reimbursed by the company, and, in the transition chaos, no one had thought to ask for it back. The first call was from a woman in my old department named Sheila. Sheila had been with me for 11 years and was the second sharpest person in any room she walked into. I let it go to voicemail. "Hey, it's me. Call me when you get a chance, okay? Just call me." I called her back from my personal phone. "The indirect cost submission for Q1, she said, before I'd even said hello. "Derek told IT to migrate the cost pool allocations to the new system last week. Nobody told them about the government contract exclusions. The fringe benefit rates are wrong. The submission goes to DCAA on the 15th. The 15th was 4 days away. I did the math in my head. Wrong fringe benefit rates in a DCAA submission meant a question cost finding. A question cost finding on a cost reimbursable contract meant the government could demand repayment of disallowed costs. On our largest contract, we were talking about a potential exposure somewhere north of $400,000, possibly more, depending on how far back they pulled the thread. "Who knows?" I asked. "Me," she said, "and now you. Have you told Derek?" A pause. "He's in a 2-day offsite in Charlottesville, Leadership Transformation Summit. I emailed him 4 hours ago. I called his assistant. His assistant said he's in sessions and can't be interrupted." I sat with that for a moment. "Sheila," I said, "document everything. Your email, the timestamp, his assistant's response, save it all." "I know," she said. "I've been doing this for 11 years. "I know you have," I thought. I didn't call Derek. Over the next 3 days, my work cell collected 21 calls. 8 from Sheila, trying to keep me updated. 4 from the CFO, a man named Warren who'd been hired 9 months earlier, and was, in my assessment, a decent accountant who was entirely out of his depth in a government contracting environment. 3 from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be Derek's personal cell. 2 from the company's outside counsel. 1 from Derek's assistant. 1 from a number with a 703 area code that I was fairly certain was DCAA's Northern Virginia office. 1 from my old boss's boss, the VP of Contracts, who I hadn't spoken to in 2 years, saying, "Hey, this is kind of urgent, if you can call me back." I did not call any of them back. I want to be precise about why. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't revenge in any satisfying movie sense. I simply was no longer employed by that company, and what they were experiencing was the natural consequence of removing the person who understood how that company worked and replacing them with a process none of them had bothered to learn. I'd offered, by the way. During my final 2 weeks of system access, I emailed Derek twice offering a formal transition briefing. He replied once, "We've got it covered, but thanks." They did not, as it turned out, have it covered. On day 12, I got a call from my attorney. Her name is Beverly. No, wait, I need to be careful here. Let me just call her my attorney. She called to tell me the separation agreement had a clause that was unenforceable under Virginia law, and that the non-disparagement language was broader than standard, and that she'd be sending a counterproposal. While she was talking, my work cell buzzed with a text from Derek. The first time he'd ever texted me directly. I know we left things awkwardly. There might be a consulting arrangement that makes sense here. Would you be open to a conversation? I showed it to my attorney, who was still on the line. She said, "Don't respond yet." I didn't respond yet. What happened next took about 6 weeks to fully unfold, and I'll try to tell it in the right order. The DCAA submission went in on the 15th with the incorrect fringe benefit rates. Whether Derek ever got Sheila's email before the submission, I genuinely don't know. What I know is that it went in wrong. The audit flag came back in 11 days, unusually fast, which suggested someone at DCAA was paying close attention to this contractor. Later, I would understand why. Because it turned out the DCAA audit wasn't only about the fringe benefit rates. This is the part of the story I didn't see coming. I want to be honest about that. I had no idea, when I was sitting in that separation meeting watching Derek talk about fresh perspectives, that there was a larger problem underneath everything. Quentin Marsh, the founder, the retired colonel, the man who hired me and told me he needed someone who was right, had passed away 14 months earlier. What I learned, 6 weeks after my termination, was that the estate was in dispute. Quentin's daughter, my employer, Derek's wife, was in a legal battle with Quentin's son from his first marriage over the terms of the estate and the company valuation. And the company valuation depended, in significant part, on the accuracy of the financial records going back several years. My financial records I'd kept meticulously, accurately, and in full compliance with government contracting standards for 2 decades. Records that, I was told by a very calm attorney who called me at home on a Tuesday morning, had been altered in the 9 months following my departure. Not by a lot. The alterations were subtle, the kind of thing that wouldn't be obvious to someone who didn't know where to look. But I knew where to look, and so, apparently, did the estate's forensic accountants, who had requested the originals through discovery and found that they didn't match the company's current books. The attorney who called me was representing Quentin's son. She asked if I would be willing to speak with her. I called my own attorney first. My attorney called me back in 40 minutes and said, "I think you should take the meeting." I took the meeting. I want to be clear, I didn't testify against anyone to settle a personal score. What happened in that deposition room was simply that I told the truth. I described the financial records as I had maintained them. I described the process as I had maintained them. I described the process as I had established. I described specifically 2 entries in the indirect cost pool that I flagged as inconsistent with everything I knew about how that cost pool had been built and maintained. The forensic accountant on the other side of the table asked me if I had documentation of the original figures. I did. I'm a person who backs things up. Always have been. When you work in compliance for 22 years, documentation isn't a habit. It's a reflex. I had copies of the quarterly reconciliations going back to 2009 on an external drive that sat on a shelf in my home office between a picture of my youngest daughter at her college graduation and a coffee mug from the 2014 Richmond Marathon that I never actually ran but got from a friend who did. I brought the drive to the meeting. I watched the other attorney's face change when I said that. She excused herself for about 4 minutes. When she came back, she was very polite and very careful. The deposition lasted 3 hours. I drove home and took my dog for a walk, which is what I do when I need to think without actually thinking. A long loop through the neighborhood, the dog, a 10-year-old beagle who has no interest in politics or corporate malfeasance, investigating every mailbox post with tremendous seriousness. My wife was on the back porch when I got home. "How'd it go?" she said. "Fine," I said. She looked at me. "Really fine," I said. "I just told the truth." She nodded. That was enough for her. That has always been enough for her. I'll tell you how it ended, because I think that's what people want to know, and I think they deserve to know it plainly. The estate litigation settled 8 months later. The terms are confidential, and that confidentiality I'll respect, but Quentin's son received a significantly larger share of the estate than the initial filing would have given him. The DCAA matter resulted in a formal finding of questioned costs and a repayment demand. The company's largest government contract was placed on enhanced monitoring, which in practical terms means they now have an auditor essentially embedded in their reporting process. Derek resigned 4 months after the deposition. The official statement said he was pursuing other opportunities. The LinkedIn post he made about it talked about exciting new chapter energy. I read it once and didn't think about it again. Quentin's daughter, my employer, the woman who signed off on the decision to let me go, is still running the company. I don't have animosity toward her. I think she made a series of decisions based on incomplete information and misplaced trust, which is something most of us do at some point. The difference is usually in the consequences. Sheila was promoted to head of financial compliance. She called to tell me, and her voice had a particular quality that I recognized. The sound of someone who finally has room to do the work they've always been capable of doing. I was genuinely happy for her. As for me, I'm not going to pretend the last year and a half has been easy. The first few months were disorienting in a way I hadn't anticipated. I'd been defined by that work for a long time, and when it was gone, I had to figure out who I was without it. That's not a small thing. Anyone who tells you early retirement or forced retirement is just more free time hasn't had it happen to them. But here's what I want to say. If you're sitting somewhere right now feeling like the thing you built doesn't matter because someone younger with better buzzwords walked in and decided it didn't, the work was real. The records were accurate. 22 years of getting it right every quarter, every audit, every reconciliation. That didn't disappear when I handed in my badge. It was all still there, on a hard drive on a shelf in my home office, right where I left it. They needed me to go quietly. I did go quietly. I just took the receipts with me. I think about Everett a lot. The security guard who shook my hand on my way out and didn't say a word. That silence meant more to me than any exit interview ever could have. He knew. People who've been around long enough always know. What I've come to understand about this whole thing is that it wasn't really about me. It was about what happens when an organization stops valuing the people who actually understand how it works and starts rewarding the people who are best at describing how it should work. Derek could talk about compliance architecture for 45 minutes without saying anything that would survive contact with a real DCAA auditor. I couldn't do that. I never learned how to say nothing with that kind of confidence. Maybe that was my failure. I don't think so anymore. The records were always going to tell the truth. That's the thing about doing honest work over a long period of time. It accumulates. 22 years of accurate reconciliations don't disappear because someone decides your desk should belong to a newer model. They sit on a hard drive on a shelf in your home office, patient as anything, waiting for the moment someone needs to know what actually happened. I didn't plan for any of this. I want to be clear about that. I didn't keep those backups as ammunition. I kept them because keeping thorough records is the only way I know how to work. It's the same integrity that made me good at the job in the first place, that made me dangerous to people who'd been cutting corners after I left. You can't separate those two things. The same discipline that builds the foundation is the same discipline that survives the demolition. And that's the part that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. When Sheila called me on day 9, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sad mostly. Sad that it got to this point. Sad that he had to carry that weight alone in an office where nobody else understood the stakes. She's sharp enough to have seen it coming long before I did. The promotion she got was 20 years overdue. Would I tell someone going through something similar, being pushed out, passed over, dismissed as obsolete by people who haven't earned the right to make that call? Is this, the work you did was real whether or not they acknowledge it. Your understanding of how things actually function doesn't expire when your badge does. And the habits that made you good at your job, the discipline to document, the honesty to flag problems even when it's uncomfortable, the steadiness to keep going when the recognition stopped coming, those aren't liabilities. They're the whole thing. They're what's left when everything else falls apart. I walked out of that deposition building at 4 in the afternoon and drove home and took my dog for a walk. Same loop, same mailboxes, same beagle investigating the same fence posts with the same absolute seriousness. Nothing dramatic. But I felt like myself again, which I realized on that walk I hadn't felt in a long time. They needed someone who would go quietly and take nothing with them. I went quietly. The rest was their mistake.